Bedtime stories. Today we're reading a book called Sea Glass Summer by Michelle Hoot. Some years ago, a boy named Thomas spent his summer at his grandmother's island cottage. Early one morning, Thomas's grandmother gave him a magnifying glass. "This belonged to your grandfather," she said. Thomas liked the magnifying glass because it made every grain of sand look as big as a rock. He liked that dark clamshells became swirling masses of black, gray, and white. Thomas's grandmother picked up something from the rocky shore. "What did you find?" he said. She opened her hand. "A piece of sea glass." "It doesn't look like glass." Grandmother placed it in Thomas's hand. Years ago, something made of glass was dropped into the sea, and after being broken and tossed in salt water and sand, the pieces turned smooth and creamy and cloudy. "Where do you think it came from?" "I'm not sure," Grandmother said, "but your grandfather used to say that each piece of sea glass has a story to tell." That night, with the sea glass on the table beside him, Thomas dreamed of being in a shipyard. Kellen wiggled through the crowd, hoping for a better view. He and Papa waited at the shipyard for the ceremony to begin. Over the heads of people, a large Navy destroyer, a powerful mass of iron and steel ready for battle, held together with sweat and hard work of many craftsmen, rose from the dock. "Did you really build her, Papa?" Papa laughed. "Not by myself, son." "Are you proud?" "Proud as a man can be." On the platform, men and ladies dressed as if it was Sunday morning, gathering at the bow for a ceremonious for the enormous ship. "What's happening?" Kellen whispered when an elegant woman stepped forward. "Shh. Miss Knox is about to speak," Papa said, and then placed a finger to his lips. Look at all these people. Kellen stood on his tiptoes just in time to see Mrs. Knox swing a bottle of champagne. "I christen the ship the USS Frank Knox," she shouted over the cheer of crowds, and the green glass bottle shattered into 100 pieces and fell into the water. She really smashed that. Each morning that summer, Thomas and his grandmother hurried down to the beach to see what the tide had left behind. Once Thomas found a real treasure, a large chunk of sea glass with a few letters on it. "Sun," just barely written on its surface. Thomas wondered what the letters might have been part of and what story this piece of glass might have. When Thomas slipped between the cool sheets that night, he dreamed of wind and waves and terrible storms. The captain's shouting orders could barely be heard over the roar of the wind and men scurrying to their stations. "Lower the sails," while the white sails they had once billowed lay in tatters. The mast creaked and groaned against the angry wind. The schooner listed to starboard, and sailors slid across the flooded deck. The storm raged, and the brave men fought until they heard the captain's desperate cry, "Abandon ship." The captain stayed with his vessel until every last sailor was safe, and then he too boarded a lifeboat and headed for home. Below the decks of the mighty ship, pots and pans crushed to the gallery floor. Shelves of canned wax beans and peaches were toppled, and one mason jar after another shattered. When a ferocious wave came up through the bow of the schooner, it took the ship and all its contents to the bottom of the ocean. Throughout that summer, Thomas' favorite days were sea glass days. and his favorite nights were sea glass nights. As the summer days grew shorter, Thomas's grandmother began to prepare the cottage for autumn, and Thomas continued to comb the shore for more of those sea treasures. One morning, grandmother said, "We'll leave for the mainland soon, probably tomorrow." As an osprey soared overhead, they descended the staircase of the beach one last time. Thomas hoped to find one more piece of sea glass. He hoped to find one more, just one, like an exciting dream. He switched and searched and switched and searched and found all he found that day were rocks and broken clamshells. I have experienced that. As he lay in bed that night, Thomas could smell the salt of the ocean. He could hear the whisper in the wind. He looked at his grandfather's magnifying glass on the bedside. Perhaps he'd dream of his grandfather. Finally, his eyelids became heavy. That night, Thomas dreamed of nothing. In the morning, Thomas gathered his favorite summer treasures: a smooth beach rock, 2 clamshells, grandfather's magnifying glass, and his precious sea glass, and boarded a ferry. When the ferry lurched forward but he lost his balance, and grandfather's magnifying glass slipped from his fingers onto the big boat's wooden deck, with a heavy heart, Thomas began to pick up what was left of the shredded and shattered magnifying glass. Then grandmother helped him wrap the pieces in his handkerchief. He stood and watched as the island disappeared from view. Thomas's sea glass summer was over. Not so many years ago, a girl named Annie arrived at her family's cottage by the sea. Annie was a collector of all sorts and treasures. At home, she collected acorn cups and pine cones and meadow flowers. At the seashore, she found different things to collect. She delighted that the clamshells and the smoother rocks were there, and one day when Anne was exploring the shallow tide near the cottage, she found an unusual piece of sea glass. "Pow, pow, Tom!" Annie raced to her grandfather's beach chair and placed her treasure in his hand. "Look what I found!" Papa Tom lifted the piece of sea glass in the sun. It was worn, and the once clear glass was the double cloudy white. But in Tom's hand, it felt strangely familiar. "You know, they say each piece of glass has a story of its own," he said. "Just imagine what tale this glass could tell." That night, with her treasures by her side, Annie slept soundly and dreamed of a boy named Thomas. It's a beautiful seascape. And that is the end. So that was Sea Glass Summer by Michelle Hoots. Thanks for joining me. Have a great day.